gotta get your money's worth. Right, sounds on, we're recording.
I just started the book. Sometimes.
I've got to get one of those, value them both magnetic stickers for my car.
Yeah, that's not a great idea.
Peggy has one on her car.
Yeah.
Are they have?
And
They have some out there now?
I didn't see any on my way in. But
Okay.
somebody pulled around her and pulled up next to her and flipped her off and started yelling at her about her bumper sticker.
Really?
Yeah, I thought, gosh, I want one of those.
Well, one of our members said that they put it on their car and about a day or two later it disappeared.
Oh yeah.
So you want to put on there?
So I've got one. I need another one.
Yeah.
It's 9:30, so I'll start. I won't make you sing because you only got a few, but we are recording, just so you know. So I know I'm boring you with the information, but we're going to finish up Zealots, and then we'll be talking about Teen Hodos the whole rest of the time. So as soon as this magic comes up,
I read that there may have been as many as 7 sects of Judaism at the time, but we don't know anything about the 2 mystery sects.
yeah, I think it's Eusebius. Eusebius writes that there are 7 sects, but from our historical documentation, we can only identify 5.
Yeah.
And we think that what happened is that Eusebius may have been talking about, just like in the Zealots, right? The Zealots, no, not the Zealots, the Essenes, right? The Essenes had this group that were like monks, and then they had this group that were normal-ish people.
Yeah.
Right? So, they're thinking that he subdivided these other groups. But there is a thing, and I haven't taken the time, I've seen the list before of the 7 from, I think it's Eusebius, I'm almost certain it's Eusebius. But, like I said, we think there's subgroups. And by the way, the Zealots, okay, so, I want to finish up the Zealots. And the reason I'm giving you this punishment, the reason I'm looking at this is because that way, when we talk about these things, like for example, one thing I thought was really interesting is Ann brought up last week, she said, well, I thought the Pharisees were the stricter group. Well, we find out the Pharisees are the least strict. And that's one of the things that caused that big collusion problem with Christ. Because I told you that, remember we had the 4 schools of Phariseeism. And they're the 4 schools of the rabbis. So the Galil, Jerusalem school, the Babylonian school, and the Alexandrian school. And they were all in contention because of the Mishnah and the Talmud and the way they interpreted things. What we found, the Sadducees go by the Torah, and the Pharisees considered them to be strict. And then the Essenes were even stricter. Whoa! So, what's the problem with this picture? The problem with this picture is it means we don't understand the history of the times as well as we think we ought to, right? Or we ought to. And that's, whatever. I think that's one of the reasons I give for punishing you with giving you all kinds of information about these different groups, because if we see what history tells us about them, as well as the New Testament tells us about them, then maybe we can see it in context. And I'll try to bring that in whenever we talk about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. That's what I want to do. As a matter of fact, if you notice what I'm doing, this is my overall plan in writing this manuscript and also presenting the material to you. Instead of doing a huge series on information beforehand and hoping you'll remember it all, as each topic gets brought up. You notice they didn't mention the Sadducees, they talked about the priests and the Levites, right? So I probably should have gone into more detail. We did the whole Torah, so we know what the Sadducees we knew what the priests and Levites were all about. But the minute they mentioned Pharisee, I wanted to bring in the Pharisees, you know, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and Zealots, and try to explain them. So I used historical information.
As you said, there were different schools within these groups. Some were more liberal, some were not. So it's hard to know what they believed.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Tammy made the comment, at least to me, she says, well, you know, with the Pharisees, she could see why Jesus was so irritated with them, right? The Sadducees and the Essenes, well, the Essenes are just an interesting group. But the Sadducees said we went from the Torah and we don't trust the Mishnah and the Talmud, right? But yet the Pharisees said, well, we're going to go with the Mishnah and the Talmud. Well, can you see how that might irritate? Well, Talmudic information is really good information, so don't blow that off. It's really good historical information. But to base your Judaism on it seems to me to be a bad thing, right? Because God gave them the Torah and said, this is it. So now you bring in more stuff, and now you make commentary on it. Yes, sir.
So would it be fair to say that people may have thought the Pharisees were more strict because they were following all these man-made rules and dictating that everyone follow all these man-made rules instead of just following the Torah clearly? It came across that they were stricter because they had 50,000 more rules.
It comes across to us that they're stricter. But in the period, they would have not been considered stricter. Because, let's see. So, the Pharisees, as I said, my example, the Pharisees said if I put a rope, the Talmud says that as long as it's an enclosed courtyard, you're okay. You can go walk within it, right, in the Shabbat. But they said, what is an enclosed courtyard? Defined by the Mishnah. And the Talmud, they said, the argument, they said, if we enclose it with a rope, if you're going to enclose it with a rope, so can we make a rope long enough to enclose Jerusalem? What would the Sadducees say?
Go
No.
for it.
No, you can't do that, right?
But the Sadducees would have not cared about the original rule about the courtyard in the first place, right? But the Torah says no work on the Sabbath, but then, like, how do you define work was then the big question.
How far can you walk, right?
Right, how far can you walk and what's work, I can see why they got real strict since the Lord told them to put to death that one guy who was gathering sticks on the Sabbath, and they're like, we better be real strict about what we call work, I suppose.
Exactly. Yeah, precisely. Because they saw it as a problem, right? And so they saw it as a problem of sin. And the Pharisees, you can already see, you see, here's the thing, right? The Sadducees were totally based in their culture of Jerusalem and the sacrifice. Now they knew that sacrifice wouldn't work for intentional sin. They knew that. It's in the Talmud even. It's in the Torah even. They knew it beyond a shadow of a doubt. But their focus was on Jerusalem and the sacrifice. What was the focus of the rabbis, of the Pharisees?
Like how you live your life the rest of the time.
Well, maybe, but I think teaching is probably, they were proselytizing. They were proselytizing the world. And so they were out in the diaspora. And so those people in the diaspora that were Jews, remember I told you the 36 big ones? There's 36 big ones, and one of them is that you hear the horn blow, the shofar blow in Jerusalem on Yom Kippur. If you don't hear it in Jerusalem on Yom Kippur, what happens?
You're done.
You're done. That's it. That's all. It's all she wrote. There's no forgiveness. There's no recompense. If you even have a grain of leaven in Passover period, what happens? You're done. There's no, even if you made a mistake, right? And I told you that God knew that we couldn't follow all the law, the letter of the law, the way He told you, but He gave us the dietary law, or He gave the laws of the kosher, he gave the kosher laws to the Jewish people to indicate to us the impossibility of us following the law. Even to the point of, like, for example, blood, right? You can't eat blood, but yet you can eat meat. But if you eat meat, you got to eat blood. And by the way, gravy is really blood, you know. So, you know, it's, and don't you love your gravy? My kids do, right? So anyway, I think this is really important stuff to think about, because that's what Jesus is all about, right? And we're going to learn more and more. It's very, I just love the way John starts. I know I'm going on a sidetrack here, but I think it's important. John starts, in the beginning was a logical argument. We translate it word, but it doesn't mean word at all in Greek. In the beginning, Christ was a logical argument. Well, Shazam, that means that we should be thinking, right, about stuff. And so people that say just believe and don't think, I'm like, what? That's not God.
So back to the Sadducees and saying no to the rope around Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Since they only worked off the Torah, what would they say about, like, you know, how far can you go and stuff like that? What would they tell? By what standards do they have to be strict, I guess I would say.
Well, you know, I think this is really interesting, because if you remember, we already talked about how the Essenes took their ball and went home, right, or left. And so they apparently took the high priest with them. So the guys that are left may or may not be Aaronic priests. They may not, you know, they're most likely Levites, but Maccabeus was not an Aaronite. He was a Levite. So I bet you they kept their mouth shut and let the Pharisees run the den. Because what happens if you really oppose things that people really want to do? I
They'll
mean,
start digging up dirt on you.
well, we're seeing the effect in America, right?
Yeah.
We have a minority of people that are pro-death, you know, pro-abortion in our country, but yet we see these people coming out of the woodwork like you know, worms and maggots, basically acting as if they are representing the viewpoint of, you know, millions, and they're not.
And
And
get
so,
canceled.
cancel culture, yeah. So how would you, you know, the Sadducees depend on what? What did the Sadducees depend on for their livelihood?
The people bringing the sacrifices.
The people bring the sacrifices. So if the Pharisees got a little bit, you know, sideways with the Sadducees, even though the Sadducees kept them off the Sanhedrin, they gave them 4 seats. Here, you guys can have 4 seats, right? But what do you think would have happened if they got sideways? Especially with the people that are teaching the children, all the children.
Pharisees would have raised up the population and overthrown the Sadducees.
Most likely, something would have happened. And by the way, that's what happened eventually, because Christ, when the destruction of the temple, the Sadducees are done. There's still Pharisees everywhere. They're called the rabbinic. That's rabbis in the synagogues, right? That's the way it works. So the Sadducees lost big time. And by the way, I think that we can show in Acts, most of the Sadducees became Christians. Most of the priests became Christians. We can see that in lots of ways, just from the Acts of the Apostles. Really interesting, right? Yeah, it talks about it, right? Not to mention the fact that Luke was probably written to the high priest, Theophilus, right? Lover of God in Greek. Go figure. Just saying. Anyway, so here's the zealots, and here's really why there may be 7. You know, Eusebius probably mentions there are 7 groups. And by the way, if you bring, I need to research that, because I've seen it before, but I never wrote it down and I never captured the thing. But I know there's 7 groups that he mentions. Amid the growing unrest in the decades leading up to the war, that is the war, the big one in 70 AD, there was broad resistance to Roman occupation, including protests against provocative actions by the procurator Pilate. Yeah, Pilate. Remember what Pilate did? It's recorded in Luke. Maybe he recorded someplace else. But he brought the Imagios. He brought the Imagios. We know this from history, and we know this from Luke. The Imagios are the if you read Centurion, if you can get a copy, I heard they're $1,000 a piece. Boy, I wish you could get some of that action. But in Centurion, I talked about they didn't fully comprehend in history the Imagios, and I think I teased out the thing from military stuff. Because the Imagios, we know that every legion carried a symbol. Like, for example, the bull legions carried a bull, the lion legions carried a lion, and then each of the centuries in each of the centuries, and what's the other group? The bigger group. I've read my own book in a long time. Every legion has, I think, 6 cohorts. Each cohort had their own symbol. So every legion had a symbol, every cohort had a symbol, and every century had a symbol. And if anybody who was in the military, been in military training, what does every squadron or every, not company, yeah, infantry company have?
Patches.
Not just patches, they have a logo, but they also have a guidon with a flag, right? And what do you put on your guidon? Your ribbons. What did they do? And I should have pictures. I should bring the pictures. Anyway, the Imagios were pictured of the deified emperors. And guess what? What did that break? Which commandment did that? Well, which commandment did bulls on pikes?
Graven image.
Yeah, no, great.
Graven image.
Graven images. And when they brought, and by the way, if you were a Jewish person, you couldn't have your photograph done in Jerusalem at this time.
Because photography.
I was gonna
has
say,
etiquette.
photography wouldn't be around for a long, long time.
Because they figured they thought it was a graven image. So even to draw your picture or to have your picture done was a graven image. As a matter of fact, Jewish communities did not agree with photography for a long time. And you don't just see that in Jewish communities, you also see it in other communities. Asian,
Yeah.
Amish, a lot of Asian Oriental cultures believe that, that you're taking a person's soul by taking their picture, right? A lot of this, it's very interesting how this idea of graven image comes out. But anyway, Pilate brought the Imagios into Maritama, into the port that they built and named Caesarea Maritama. And when he did that, that's when the Jews went there. And remember, it says that Pilate watered the altars with their blood. And we believe that later on he tried to enact in Centurion. I talk about another event where we believe he brought them into Jerusalem, and my character, Abinadar, recommended he take them out because of the problems they would call, provocation it would cause with the Jewish people. Because the problem of the Romans, what was the problem of the Romans? They weren't culturally aware. This is our problem. Anybody read The Ugly American? Read The Ugly American. Have you ever read The Ugly American? It's about how we made mistakes in the Vietnam War and in Asia because we didn't understand the cultures. But yet the Soviet Union understood the cultures. When you have people, when you go into other cultures, you speak the language, you know the culture. You don't do things that really irritate them because they won't support you. This is wise. This is what we do in special operations. When you do special operations, you train your people to not irritate your allies. Because if you irritate your allies, you're done. Yeah. And so what did old Pilate got bad advice, right? The Romans said, well, every other nation we went into, we carry our legion thing, and everybody goes, yeah. We go to Jerusalem, and they go, right? Why? Because culturally it was incorrect for their place. And so, this was the problem. And the thing is that, okay, and I'll mention it again, I think it's a beautiful example. We're going to see it, it's going to talk about it. But the big deal was, they went to the temple in Jerusalem, and there's a mesocline, a wall around it. And there's an altar within the wall. And so what did the Romans say? What did the Greeks say? They said, that's terrible, that's pagan. You can't have a temple altar enclosing. That's totally sacrilegious. So they destroyed the mesocline, the wall, and they began sacrificing on the altar to Zeus. Why? That's their culture. That's what you do. The Hebrews said, well, that's the abomination of desolation, right? But the Romans and the Greeks said, hey, what's wrong with you? Are you crazy in the head? This is what we normally do.
That was one reason that Pilate didn't want to offend the Jews in Jesus' trial, because he'd been already
I agree. Yeah, and I think he got spanked. Well, he got spanked multiple ways. He got. The biggest thing is, how did they grade a procurator? How did Rome grade you? The Roman Senate.
You deliver the tribute.
The revenue stream, that what we like to translate as taxes, is not taxes, it's tribute. And so what they graded you on is how much tribute did you bring out of these nations. Because why? We got to fund the legions, we got to fund Rome, we're doing bread and circuses, and for goodness sakes, people are going to take us over if we don't feed them, right? Wink, wink, nod, nod. And plus we have rapid inflation. No, we didn't have inflation because we had a currency tied to gold in the Greek and Roman times, and so you can't inflate a currency that's not a fiat currency. You can't spend what you don't have. So they wanted money coming into the coffers. And so what happened? When the people got irritated at Pilate, he didn't get any money. And he didn't get any money, then he couldn't give money to the Roman Senate. In any case, I think they'll get into this. All right, here. Actions by threaten a strike against the rising corpse for the Romans when the Emperor Gaius Caligula sought to put a statue of Zeus in the temple. Now, see, we say that's an abomination. But what do you think Caligula thought?
It's an abomination not to have one there.
Bingo, exactly. Riots at feast time in Jerusalem in reaction to offenses of Roman soldiers, official delegations to Rome protesting inept procurators, prophetic actions. What do you think? What do you think the offenses by Roman soldiers is? You know what they are, right? A Roman soldier could ask you to carry his pack for a mile, a stadius. So what do you think happened when the Shabbat and a Roman soldier said, hey, carry my pack? They're not supposed to do it, exactly. And so what happened? They said no, and the Roman soldier, I don't think they were supposed to kill him. You know, they just didn't kill him, but they probably roughed him up. But that, okay, in Centurion I point out that Abinadar helped Pilate figure out some of these things. That's my whole point in my book that I wrote, because I wanted to show why Pilate went from, really arrogant to pretty much, you see what he did in the trial against Christ? He gave him everything he wanted, right? Pretty much. He didn't really oppose them much, but he did do some really interesting things. We'll see more about when we get into deeper into John. Anyway, delegations to Rome protesting at procurators, prophetic actions, oracular pronouncements by apocalyptic figures, banditry, kidnappings, and assassinations. Boy, it sounds like Mexico, right? Resistance to Roman rule is widespread and cut across all sectors of the society. The war broke out in 66 CE. That's AD. That's not a great idea. When the procurator Florus, it wasn't Pilate anymore, tried to seize money from the temple treasury. That's what Pilate had done before, but he built an aqueduct with it. After the populace drove Florus out of Jerusalem and successfully held off Cetus Gallus, the legate. What's a legate? You know what a legate is? That's the guy who runs the legions. He ran him out of Syria when he arrived to restore Roman order. What did he arrive with? A legion, or at least parts of a legion, at least some cohorts. The Jewish declaration of war came when the lower priests ceased to sacrifice to God on behalf of the emperor. Subsequently, the traditional high priest assumed control of the wartime government and prepared for the Romans to return. Oh, wait, that's funny. Subsequently, the traditional high priest assumed control of the wartime government and prepared for the Romans to return. Do you see that? I guess the Pharisees are right. The Sadducees were colluding. For the war period, Josephus identifies, in addition to the wartime government, 5 revolutionary groups, each with its own social and geographic origins, motivations, methods, and goals. Not all the groups embraced a zealous mentality and were often in conflict with each other, except when confronted with the common Roman Empire. Josephus mentions the zealots last in order. So he mentions, as I said, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, zealots, and teen hodos. So here's a group of the zealots, and these are the different zealot groups. Scari, fought for no Lord but God under the Messianic leadership of Judah, Galileans' descendants. When other revolutionary groups forced them out of Jerusalem in 66 AD, they remained during the rest of the war in the fortress of Masada. Where in 74 AD, they got whacked. John of Gisalia, Johann ben Levi, that's interesting. Ben means son of, leader of the Galilean contingent, gained the confidence of the wartime government, which he then betrayed to the zealots. That's interesting too. Simon bar Giora from Gerasa in the Decapolis. Decapolis is Greek. Raised an army of freed slaves. I wrote about this in my book, and overran Idumea in 69 AD. He was joined by some of the nobles and seized most of Jerusalem. A Messianic strongman. Simon led the coalition of the revolutionary groups in defense of Jerusalem in 70 AD and lost. They got wiped. The Edomenes, a local militia, helped the Zealots to overthrow a provisional government. The Zealots, primarily priests from Jerusalem and the Judean peasantry, declared war by stopping the official sacrifice for Caesar. Later, under democratic, what? Democratic? There ain't no democratic. They occupied the temple and chose a high priest by lot. That is democratic. And in 68 CE, overthrew the wartime government, but then they got wiped, right? So these are the 5 groups that were identified outside of the normal groups. So that, for example, Eusebius, when he made his list, I think he was including some of these in the breakdown. The war lasted 4 years. And how come we don't learn about this war, right? We're getting more information about this war than most of the time we ever get anywhere. And this is just talking about the Zealots. The Roman general Vespasian overran the countryside of Galilee and Judea, thereby isolating Jerusalem. When he became emperor in 69, his son Titus assumed the siege of Jerusalem, eventually destroying the city, burning the temple, executing the Jewish warriors, and consigning many families to slavery after a triumphal procession in Rome. Flavius Silva led the Roman troops to overcome Jewish holdouts at a few fortresses, including Masada. And they didn't have to fight much in Masada, just surrounded it there. Causes of war were many and complex, incompetent and corrupt. Okay, this is interesting. Incompetent and corrupt Roman governors. Okay, I don't necessarily disagree, but it's culture. It's always culture. So if you ever get to be a procurator or governor in a Roman Empire, right? Figure out the culture and then accommodate the people as much as you can so you can get more tribute. That's the way to do it. There's a lot of literature in the... We don't own all the pieces, but there's a little bit left over of letters and stuff. So there's a lot going on in this period. Deteriorating Roman policies toward Jews. If they're attacking you, there is no policy. War is war, okay? We're seeing that in Ukraine, right? When you go to war, you go to war. A determined Jewish opposition to foreign domination, yeah, but with no... okay, what's the first thing that the Romans did? What is the first thing you do when you establish a government over the people you conquer? What's the first thing you do? Take their weapons. So that's why the weapons they had, they call it a sword. It's not a sword, a macarena, whatever. It's not a sword, it's a little knife. And so, that Peter had a little fish knife for gutting fish. Now, let them keep some of their tools, but definitely not swords, because swords could be used in warfare. And that's why, by the way, Samson used the jawbone of an ass because there were no weapons. So he took a jawbone of an ass and still destroyed the Philistines. Anyway, let's see, peasant revolt, widespread bandit, whatever, primary... conviction that God would honor the Jewish cause, a zealous commitment to cleanse the land of idolatry. A lot of this is worth, I wish we had more information. Most of it comes from Josephus. Major scholarly controversies arising primarily from the biased, this is interesting too, biased and often unreliable accounts of Josephus. Wait a second, he's our primary source, and you're saying he's unreliable and biased?
By what evidence do they have to say he's unreliable then?
Or biased.
I agree. This is Rhodes. It's a encyclopedic information. The reason I like this is because it should get you thinking. Maybe I should write some comments in my manuscript about this. But yeah, why would you think they're biased and unreliable? Now, I would argue that what's more reliable? The New Testament data, right, that we have. But yet they don't talk much about that, which is interesting. And what's interesting is we also don't have much New Testament information on the destruction of Jerusalem. It was something that was too common. Why did Josephus write his stuff?
He was funded by the Romans.
Because the Romans funded him and wanted him to write a account of the history of the time for them. And he was a Greek writer and a Greek speaker who also was a Hebrew-ish. He was Hebrew. And so he wrote down, basically, what's he doing? He's pleasing his masters and probably put some good stuff in there. I mean, I don't think it's, I would say that it's not biased and not unreliable necessarily. There is no other accounts you have that really can compare to them. So, except New Testament accounts. Anyway, have centered on the ancient usage of the term zealot, the extent of his religious zeal among the revolutionaries and the populace, the nature and makeup of each revolutionary group, whether the wartime government was moderate or revolutionary, and the relative importance of social, economic, political, religious factions as causes of the war. I think what's really interesting, note this, okay, we'll close out with the zealots, but who caused them to lose? They did.
Yeah, they were, they may have had some righteous anger about bad things the Romans did, but a lot of them turned into just like, as it said, banditry, kidnapping, fighting against other Jews who they didn't think were totally with them, and just basically destroying their own cause.
Yeah, yeah. Do we see that today? Yeah, their own churches, right? We'll move on to 125. Question: why do you why am I missing something? I need to check it. Why then do you baptize if you're not Messiah or Elijah or the prophet? And here's the Greek. It's probably easier to see the Greek. Here's the King James. And they asked him, oh, by the way, I should ask, you probably got way too much about Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. Is it enough? We need more? I don't want to overwhelm you, but I want us to have a good foundation of understanding. And also, this might pique your interest, although Josephus is a hard read in some ways, but it's still got some good stuff in there. Anyway, King James says, and they asked him, and he said unto him, why baptizest thou then, if thou be not that Christ, nor Elias, neither that prophet? And here's the Greek, Kai Erasan, they interrogated, auton, and epen, they said to him. T is who, which, what, so you pick which one it fits within the context. Certainly, accordingly, baptizes, do you immerse? And by the way, I'll tell you, baptize means to immerse. Baptize does not mean to dip or plunk or whatever, it means to immerse, and we know that's true anyway because it's the mikvah, and we're going to talk a lot about the mikvah. I'm sure I'm going to punish you with the mikvah, but we'll learn as much as at least the Jewish people know about the mikvah before we're done. If you look, there's an R, and if you notice, there's a whole lot more usage of the identity verb in John than we ever saw in Mark. It is way common in John. The Christus, the Christ, the anointed one, not however neither Elias, Ode, not however the prophet, a foreteller. So here's a translation. Here's a direct cultural translation. And they interrogated him and said to him, why accordingly do you immerse if you are not the Christ, the anointed one, nor Elijah, nor the foreteller, the prophet? That's the first indication about immersion in John, and therefore we got to talk about immersion.
Can I ask a question real quick about the verbiage? So it has a definite article before prophet, the prophet, and like in my ESV it said it capitalizes prophets or prophet, and then in the one translation it said that prophet. So are they talking about a specific prophet there? And if so, who?
Okay, here's the Greek. Ho is a definite article, and not that. So it's the.
Right, so but that being,
The
that's
prophet.
still a definite article, you know, the prophet mean one specific one. Are they talking about someone specifically?
Yeah, they're talking about, okay, remember, okay, we did this, I'm sorry, a while ago. I could back up to it. But you remember it's from Micah and from Isaiah. And so Isaiah says Elijah will come, right? And then Micah says the prophet. And then they mix them because in Isaiah it says, and when the prophet comes, and we presume it's Elijah, but when the prophet comes, it doesn't say he'll be baptizing, but it says that he will make straight the way, right, in the wilderness, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they asked John, who are you? And John repeated back to them the quote from Isaiah. So by that we know that John is telling them without telling them that he is what?
He's that prophet.
He is that prophet. Yeah, yeah. And so
and
then
Jesus confirmed later he was the Elijah
yeah,
that was spoken of.
he was.
Okay, so they're talking about the prophet from, that's referenced by in the prophecies of the Old Testament.
Yeah, I'm sorry. What has happened that's a negative, and I don't mean there to be negatives. If you look at the translations I gave you, you'll probably be able to follow it with the biblical stuff. But because between each, I've intentionally broken it out because, like I said, when we hit a topic, I'd like to discuss that topic at least so we fully comprehend it, right? I guess we could do a whole treatise on the 5 sects of Judaism, right? And we not be done. But I did give it a couple of hours. But you see, the point is that we've even disconnected. And the other thing is, there's no problem with the NIV. If you look back, we can look back. Well, matter of fact, there's no problem in the NIV. If we look back at the translation page I gave you. And some having been set apart were out among the Pharisees, and they interrogated them. So that's a continuation where the person wrote the statement. I don't like to call them verses, I like to call them statements, because the statements were all added. That is, the numbering was all added. They were all broken up, because in the Greek there is no punctuation. There is no statement. And so our translators back in about 800 AD decided to give us, actually after that, about 1000, 1200 AD, they gave us the verses. So they broke the statements up into verses. Before they were just continuous, pretty much, but they did use punctuation. We've invented a lot since 100 AD. Just saying. And even the English language is pretty new. In any case, let's see. So, because of that, we need to talk about the mikvah and immersion. So here's a mikvah. This is a picture of an ancient mikvah. These are kind of hard to come by, but this is an ancient mikvah. And you notice there's 3. And we're going to talk about that a little bit, why there are multiples. This is really interesting stuff. So I dug some great stuff from Talmudic. This is biblical and Talmudic and Mishnah sources. So here's ritual objects. And by the way, if you know your Hebrew, I'm not good at Hebrew. Here it is right here. The mikveh is a ritual pool filled with water from a natural source. Rainwater, for example. Immersing in the mikvah purifies Jews who become ritually impure. Mikvah is also used as part of the process of converting to Judaism. Mikvah 22, and then here is a whole bunch of really cool information. If you read your Hebrew, this is what it says in Hebrew. I can't read Hebrew, so I got to go with the translation. I did not translate every single one of these pieces. However, this is pretty close. However, a spring or cistern in which water is collected shall be pure. Whoever touches such a carcass in it shall be impure. That's from Leviticus. In Jeremiah. O hope of Israel, O Lord, all who forsake you shall be put to shame. Those in the land who turn from you do men, for they have forsaken the Lord, the font of living waters. So this is the direct stuff from the Torah about the mikvah. But we're going to get more into it because the Talmudic sources give us more information. When a man has emission of semen, he shall bathe his whole body in water and remain impure until evening. All cloth or leather on which the semen falls should be washed in water and remain impure until evening. Likewise for a woman, when a man has carnal relations with her, both shall bathe in the water and remain impure until evening. These are all sources from the Hebrew website. Eruvim, that is a, what's Eruvim? Maybe you can identify. A rabbi, this is a Talmudic source. Hiva bar Ashi said above that Rav said that the laws governing impositions that invalidate ritual immersion are halakot, transmitted to Moses from Sinai. The Gemara challenges this assertion. These two are written in the Torah, as is written, and he shall bathe all his flesh in the water, Leviticus 15:16, and the sages derived that nothing should intervene between the flesh and the water. The definite article in the phrase "in the water" indicates that this bathing is performed in water mentioned elsewhere. Okay, now another reason I want to show you this is because of the discussion that we just had about Pharisees, the Mishnah, and the Talmud. Because are you already getting it? Are you already seeing this? This is Mishnah, Talmud. So what are they talking about? The Gemara, this is the arguments that are used about the mikvah in the Talmud. So this means the Sadducees, or the Pharisees, the wise guys, the rabbis are sitting around, talking about this subject, and this is their conclusions. They put in the bold. I think this is really interesting stuff. I'm sorry I've got way too much, but a lot of this we're looking at. When the one with a discharge becomes purified of his discharge, he shall count off 7 days for his purification, wash their clothes, bathe his water in fresh water, then he shall be pure. This is an immersion from a male's genitals, I think. Shabbat, or a woman, I believe, too. Leviticus, you can look it up. Shabbat, okay, Shabbat. This is Mishnah Talmud. And he made a ritual bath for them in the days of Nisan. This supports the opinion of Rav, as Rav said, when rain falls in the west, Erzatz Israel, the great witness attesting to the fact, is Euphrates. As the water flow in the Euphrates increases after the rainy season. The rainfall in northern Babylonia, where the source of Euphrates is located, is essentially parallel to the rainfall in Erzatz Israel. The increased water flow of the Euphrates in the spring is a result of the rainfall in the winter. You see what this is? This is supposed to be a rational argument why, and I don't know what the end point is, but can the Euphrates, probably the question is, can the Euphrates be used in a mikvah? The water of the Euphrates. And the reason for this question was probably the Jordan River. Do you remember the Jordan River? It was dirty, and yet, what's his name told the guy with, told Naaman, right? To go and wash in the river Jordan, and Naaman goes, it's dirty, right? And now the other thing I wanted to mention is this one up here about intervene. So when you did a mikveh, and we're going to see in a modern mikveh, because we got a whole section on modern mikveh too, but you had to have a mikveh lady for the ladies, or a mikveh guy, which is what John the Immerser did. So you went down to the riverside, go down to the river, right? You went down the riverside, and you took off all your clothes. You didn't do this clothes. And you got in the river, and you immersed yourself. And John would have a stick. The mikveh guy or lady has a stick. And he makes sure that you can't have any bandages on your body, so they check you. No bandages, no jewelry, no coverings, no nothing. And your hair can't have any bindings. But the hair of a woman, for example, or a guy, if it's long, is going to float. So the mikveh person, while you're underwater, takes your hair and presses it down under the water, because nothing can intervene between you and the water. This is really different than what we've made Christian baptism, and that's okay, because I told you before, what's the first question they asked in sub-Saharan Africa?
How much water do you need?
How much water do you need? And the answer by the church was, well, just enough, right? Whatever, right? Right? Talking about a non-rabbinical answer, right?
I'm glad we don't have to get baptized naked.
The Orthodox Church does do baptism naked, but they do let adults wear usually a white robe. Mishnah, here we go. Mishnah Shekam. On the first of Adar, they make a public announcement about the shekels concerning Kilayim. On the 15th, they read the Melga, Esther, in walled cities, and they fix the roads and the streets and the ritual water baths. And they perform all public duties, and they mark graves, and go forth also concerning Kilayim. In Jeremiah, it's deliver in time of trouble. Why are you like a stranger to the land, like a traveler who stops only for the night? Now, how does that fit? Anyway, here's some Mishnah Yoma. Mishnah Yoma. When it says Mishnah Yoma, these are sections from the Mishnah. With regard to one who says, I will sin and then I will repent, I will sin and I will repent, heaven does not provide him the opportunity to repent. And he will remain a sinner all his days. With regard to one who says, I will sin and Yom Kippur will atone for my sins, Yom Kippur does not atone for his sins. Furthermore, for transgressions between a person and God, Yom Kippur atones. However, for transgressions between a person and another, Yom Kippur does not atone until he appeases the other person. Now, why are they mentioning about sin and atonement? Because purity is part of that, right? So, to be fully atoned, we saw this in the Torah, right? To be fully atoned, number one, no intentional sin. You can't do any intentional sin. But, just to be sure, you go to the temple and you have the ascension sacrifice. You're there, you see it, you hear it. You see the sinner guilt sacrifice, you bring one. You have the priest sacrifice, you have the Thanksgiving sacrifice. So everything should be copacetic between you and God unless, well, how did you get into the temple in the first place? To be getting into the temple, you have to be clean. You have to be pure, is what they're saying. So you have to have been, if you're a male and you had an emission of semen or other things, if you have a woman and you've had your menstrual, right, and you have to wait 7 days or whatever, it's in the Torah, and then you have to go through a mikvah. And women today, and that's what we'll talk about when we get to the modern mikvah, but that's one of the main usages of it. So to even get in, remember, to be able to eat teruma, to be able to eat the Thanksgiving sacrifice or the sacrifices, you have to be clean.
I feel sorry for the women because, like, 25% of the time they're going to be unclean, and like, you know, of all the Passovers you celebrate, 25% of them you can't eat this stuff, and like, you can't go there, and
Well, the Passover is interesting because the Passover, where is the meal eaten? At home.
don't you have to be clean to eat though?
You know, that is a great question. I don't know if the rabbis totally answered that. That's an interesting question. Can a woman who's not, clean eat the Passover? And I don't know if I've ever asked or answered that question. But that is a very interesting question.
But people bring their sacrifices and stuff at the time of those pilgrim festivals, and those ones, you have to be clean to eat it or whatever. Like the poor mom of the family or whatever, she's just out of luck if she's in her period.
Well, you're supposed to bring it home, right? You bring it, you sacrifice it in the temple, but you bring it
But
home.
again, only the clean people can eat it.
Yeah, but if you live in Nazareth and you sacrifice in Jerusalem, how are you going to bring it home?
Well, you don't bring it to Nazareth, it won't last that long.
Yeah.
But you eat it that night, right, for the Passover festival. And, yeah, these are difficulties. And I think God gave the difficulties. God gave the difficulties not for us to resolve them, right?
But to understand that we need Him.
Right, exactly.
Like, thank goodness I'm Christian and born now.
Amen. Right?
Especially as a
Didn't women
woman.
have some kind of special dispensations also?
There are special dispensations, and they're all Talmudic and in the Mishnah and the Talmud. So, Gemara stuff, right? The rabbi said to him, so it's 60 tenths of flour can be mixed with a log of oil, but 61 tenths cannot be mixed. Rabbi Shimon said to them, all the measures of the sages are so. For example, in a ritual bath containing 40 seah of water, One immerses for purification. In a ritual bath with 40 seah less, the small measure of a kortov, one cannot immerse in it. Holy smoke! Okay, the Christian answer by the Christian rabbis, so to speak, was
Use what you got.
use what you got. But what's the answer here?
Gotta be exactly.
If you don't have 40 seah of water at least, right, you're done. It's it. That's all. Oh man, who's doing this measuring? I don't know. You know, they needed engineers in this period. They probably paid you well. Here's another one from Mishnah Torah. According to biblical law, any water that is gathered may be used for immersion, as it's written, the gathering of water of any kind, provided that there is enough to fill up the measure required for the complete immersion of a man's entire body. The sages have calculated the measure to be 1 cubit square by 3 cubits deep. The quantity holds 40 seahs, 60 gallons of water, whether drawn or undrawn, from any kind of receptacle. This is how they got this stuff. This is the stuff that Jesus was really irritated about, right? So you just go to the Jordan River. Do you think there's 40 seas in the Jordan River?
Well,
You see
there's
the
some.
pictures I showed you, right? That's of the, let's see. Rabbi Elzar from Ben Azar taught the point from the verse, for all your sins you should be cleansed before the Lord, for transgressions between a person and God. Yom Kippur, this is a repeat pretty much of the one before. How fortunate are you, Israel, before whom you are purified, and he purifies you. It is your Father in heaven, as stated, and I will sprinkle purifying water upon you. Okay, the Christian guys said that's works, but they said you got to immerse. So anyway, I think it's kind of funny. But do you see how these arguments are developed, right? These arguments are developed. Here's from Zechariah. The Gemara adds, we learned in a Mishnah elsewhere, with regard to sanctifying the water of purification, if one places hand or his foot or vegetable leaves in order to allow flowing water to pass through them to the barrel, the water is disqualified. But the water passes through leaves or reeds or leaves or nuts, the water remains fit. This is the principle. The water passes through an item that's susceptible to impurity, it's disqualified.
So many rules about the rules.
Well, yeah, you know, I want you to see why Jesus got...
Yeah.
Now, Jesus knew all these. He had them memorized. He had the Mishnah, the Talmud. He had everything memorized. He knew this stuff. You know, and he's probably irritated that he had to memorize it, right? I mean, even God can get really irritated, I think. Anyway, nevertheless, a fountain or a pit where there is a gathering of waters which are attached to the ground are not receptive of uncleanliness, not being included okay, I can't read that, mentioned in verse 34, since it states here, it shall remain clean. But you may also give it the meaning, he shall remain clean. He who immerses himself in them to free himself from his uncleanness. But that which touches their carrion shall be unclean. If one is in the fountain or pit, it comes in contact with their uncleanness, their carcasses. This is really interesting stuff. Obviously, they had a case in which there was a carcass in a well or something where they were using for a mikvah, and you know, maybe a mouse or rat, or
Yeah.
maybe something worse.
In that earlier verse that you said in Leviticus, just preceding it, he was talking about, these different, like, mouse and lizard and gecko and chameleon and stuff like that. That if their carcass is in it, or if you touch a carcass when you're in the... So I imagine it was not terribly uncommon that there was a dead lizard or something.
Well, yeah, and the thing is that if a gecko runs across your foot, right?
Well, it seemed to be talking only about dead ones in that whole, I was looking through that passage.
Yeah, but there's also a thing, remember when we read the Torah and it said, if you touch an unclean animal, you're unclean. And a gecko is definitely an unclean animal, right? A lizard and reptiles are considered unclean. So, I don't know why they didn't let them eat snakes.
Long before they
It
started
tastes like
selling
chicken.
insurance.
What's that?
Long before they started selling insurance.
Long before they started selling insurance. These are all Talmud Mishnah references. In addition to performing labor on one's own property in order to avoid financial loss, it is also permitted to perform labor on the intermediate days of a festival for the public welfare. One may repair damaged water cisterns that are in the public domain and clean them out by removing the dirt and sediment that accumulated there. One may repair roads, streets, ritual baths. One may attend all other public needs. So too, one may mark graves to inform the public of their ritual impurity. Okay, what do you think the Sadducees said about this?
Well, their intermediate days, do they have to not do work on all the intermediate days? I mean, they're not the Sabbaths or the high holy days they're talking about.
Just saying. Like the camel. It's the nose of the camel, right? I don't know. I think it's kind of interesting. You know, what does it mean not to do work on a Shabbat or on a festival, right? And that was festival. Yeah, it's true. Here, another Talmud. Rabbi Yemira says that Resh Lakish says water of a ritual bath is fit to be used as water of the basin. The Gemara asks, is this to say that the water in the basin does not need to be flowing water, i.e. spring water? But isn't it taught in a bar teta, that's a part of the Mishnah? The verse indicates that the innards of an offering must be washed with water and not with wine, with water and not with wine mixed with water. Okay, okay, this is not Greek arguments, okay? Remember I told you there's a huge difference between Hebrew and Greek arguments and thinking? Yeah, I know you get bored with this stuff. I just think it's interesting to see this is the Jewish thought. No, the word all comes, and the Gemara rejects this opinion. No, the word all comes to add that which is taught in the following Baratada. On the intermediate days of a festival, agents of the court go out to clear thorns from the road and to repair the city, streets, and highways, and to measure the ritual baths, to ascertain that they have the requisite quantity of water. And if any ritual bath does not contain 40 say, the minimal pressure for ritual purification, they direct a stream of water into it. What we're going to learn is, even in the modern mikvah, what they do is, apparently all the water is not rainwater. They can mix other sources of water, but it has to be, you see those three that I showed you the pictures of? Those are all connected. And apparently one of them is pure rainwater. The other two can be mixed. So as long as they're touching the ritual water, until you get a carcass of a mouse inside one of the little things. And then you
In modern mikvahs, they'll have, because it's kind of not, what's the word I'm looking for? It's hard to make a indoor pool that's filled with rainwater or whatever. They'll have like a tank underneath that's the pure water, and then they'll just have like one little hole that connects the two.
Yeah. And that's okay. Right? Just saying. Here's one. The Gemara raised another objection to Rabbi John's opinion. But does Rabbi Yohan maintain that with regard to a mixture king an item that is forbidden by rabbinic law, we do not require the permitted portion of the mixture to be greater in quantity so it can nullify the prohibited part? Did we learn otherwise in a Mishnah, mikvot, with regard to ritual bath, it contains exactly 40 c of water, the minimal measure of a fit ritual bath. This is the Talmud. Yes, sir.
I was just observing that they use the number 40. That seems to be a very popular number in a lot of Old Testament law and writings too. So there's
Because,
probably a significance to that. So.
well, remember, anything above 40 is eternity. Because I can't count that high. Now, yes, as we gained in technology, and they gained in technology, they could count higher because they had numbers. Really, if we did what they did, we could only count to 26. Right? Better use hex code, right? The Kedushin says, the Gemara comments, the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Dostai ben Judah. It is taught in the Bereta, these are statements, Rabbi Dostai ben Judah says, just as the sons of Israel are a ritual bath of purity for a halat, the daughter of a hala, who marries an Israelite, does not transmit her scalus of hala, and their daughters may marry priests. So the daughters of Israel are a ritual bath of purity for haleim, and their daughters may marry priests. Whoa, that's interesting. You see what that applies to? Remember the return to Israel? Because remember I told you, the women were the ones who The men may have not passed their genetic code, but the women are the key to the patriarchy of the Jewish people. And so, guess what's really important? The purity of their passage of that Jewishness, whatever, the matriarchal relate. You want a matriarchal thing? This is totally matriarchal. Ain't no guys in there. Yes, sir.
This is almost like a modern website. You're ever looking up a verse and you question a verse and then there's comments down below. These are just like the comments people add on a website. You get 50,000 different opinions and interpretation.
Yeah,
A little
yeah.
more polite, but.
It really is. They invented the comments in the website. They were the mission of the Talmud. I know, I'm probably boring you. We got just a little bit more of this. We'll go to modern mikvah. But I want you to understand what John was about. Now, a lot of the Talmudic stuff is later thing, and I know it's past our time. Thank you, Father, for your word. I pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray, amen. I promise we will continue to dig deep into John. I just want us to understand some of these things as we progress.
I've joined this class now for what is it, 3 weeks or something, and we've talked about one verse.